And it's truly my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Seth Jacobs, who is an assistant professor of history and has taught at Boston College since 2001. After studying theater at Yale and DePaul University, Seth actually began his career as a professional actor in Chicago, until one fateful day when he bought a book on American history to read on the train. He decided to pursue a doctorate in history, which he received from Northwestern University. His research focuses on the relationship between American domestic culture and foreign policy, especially during the Vietnam War. In 2002, he received the Stuart Bernath Article Prize from the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations, for distinguished writing. And in 2004, he appeared on several episodes of the History Channel's Command Decision show about military leaders' tactical decisions on the battlefield. But perhaps his strongest commendation comes from the students he teaches. In 2003, he was named Professor of the Year by the Boston College chapter of the Phi Alpha Theta History Honor Society. And in a recent survey by BC's undergraduate government of the best elective classes to take at the university, his US foreign policy class was one of the top 3 picks. Students noted that he does excellent impressions of numerous historical figures, including Stalin, during his classes, and that he is known to sit in one of the campus's coffee houses every Thursday for 3 hours, just so his students can come to talk to him about the class. Tonight, Seth will talk to us about his new book, America's Miracle Man in Vietnam, published by Duke University Press, in which he argues that a mid-century religious revival in America and policymakers' racist perceptions of Asians led the US to support the disastrous autocratic regime of Ngo Dinh Diem in South Vietnam. Later this year, Rowan and Littlefield will publish Seth's second book titled Sink or Swim, a work for undergraduates about the Diem-US partnership. It's an honor to have him here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Seth Jacobs.
I am deeply honored to be part of the Writers Among Us series, and I'd like to thank Jean for that incredibly gracious introduction, and I'd like to thank Ben Birnbaum and his staff for their support. I'm a junior professor, I don't have tenure. Most junior professors can only fantasize about having this kind of forum to talk about their work. I'm very grateful for the opportunity. I hope this evening's talk doesn't depart too egregiously from the consistently excellent quality of the series thus far. I should also apologize in advance for sticking quite so closely to my prepared remarks. As my students, a couple of them are here, will tell you, I love to talk, especially when the subject is me and my work. And I have an unfortunate tendency to go off on tangents if I don't stick really closely to a prepared script. I hope this stylistic rigidity won't be too off-putting. I think I'm correct in assuming you don't want to be here until midnight. So I'm going to stick to my remarks. This being a writer's series, I want to talk not only about the content of my book, but also a bit about my personal experience of writing it, because I believe that the path I followed while putting this book together is in many ways representative of the new and exciting direction in which diplomatic history is heading. As most of my fellow historians are aware, diplomatic history has long been considered something of a backwater of scholarly inquiry. Probably the most famous indictment of diplomatic history is a withering 1980 essay by Charles Meyer entitled Marking Time, the Historiography of International Relations, that really ushered in an era of critical introspection and self-flagellation among diplomatic historians. Meyer, a very distinguished Europeanist, surveyed the state of diplomatic history, particularly foreign relations of the United States, and pronounced it dismal. He claimed that diplomatic history had enjoyed, quote, no wave of transforming research, end quote. Indeed, he went so far as to call it a, quote, stepchild far removed from the cutting edge of scholarship, end quote. He identified the principal problems as a lack of theoretical rigor and an absence of methodological innovation. In his view, work in diplomatic history needed to become more consonant with trends towards social and cultural history elsewhere in the profession. As Meyer cuttingly and unfortunately accurately put it, too many books by diplomatic historians merely recounted, quote, what one clerk said to another, end quote. That's why the field was dry as dust and why nobody read those books. This sad state of affairs has begun to change in recent years. The field of diplomatic history is passing through a revolutionary stage in which categories of analysis perennially consigned by more conservative scholars to social and cultural history, categories like race and religion, are enabling historians like Mary Renda, Mary Dudziak, Michelle Mart, Kristen Hoganson, Andrew Rotter, and Robert Dean to illuminate critical dimensions of foreign policymaking long overlooked. And my book, I hope, contributes to that invigorating trend. But it didn't start out that way. I'm ashamed to admit that I initially intended to write one of those dry as dust, marking time books that Charles Meyer found so parochial and that's caused so many historians in other fields to view the discipline of diplomatic history as a wasteland. After kicking around a number of potential dissertation topics with my advisor in graduate school, I initially decided to do an analysis of the 1954 Geneva Conference that divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. I caught what I thought was a discrepancy in the literature about that conference. Most studies of it had condemned the performance of the American delegation at Geneva, led by Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. But I noted that the terms of the so-called Geneva Accords were awfully favorable to the United States, especially considering that our ally, France, had just been defeated by the communist Viet Minh. So I was going to do an assessment of the Geneva Conference based on research at the Eisenhower Library in Abilene, the Dulles Papers in Princeton, and the National Archives in College Park, along with a host of other archives housing official government papers, covering in numbing detail what a variety of clerks said to one another in the summer of 1954. And the yield of all this research would, I assumed, be a text that challenged Geneva Conference orthodoxy and presented the American delegation, especially Dulles, as having played the hand it was dealt more skillfully than had previously been assumed. Really interesting, right? Boy, it gets your heart racing, doesn't it? I'm sure a lot of people, particularly non-specialists, would have just raced to the bookstore to pick up a copy of that. But that was my original project. Arch-traditional, dogmatically unimaginative, moss-back diplomatic history. I did not intend to blaze any new trails. I was perfectly content to be a boring diplomatic historian. However, I got lucky, because in the course of my first visit to the Eisenhower Library, I was struck by something that I encountered in cables to Washington from those Americans present both at the Geneva Conference and in South Vietnam in the mid-1950s. I should say parenthetically here that at this stage in my research, I was not especially interested in Ngo Dinh Diem, South Vietnam's prime minister at the time of the Geneva Conference, and later South Vietnam's first president. I felt I had a pretty good handle on Diem and the reasons why the Eisenhower administration supported Diem as America's strongman in Southeast Asia. I completely accepted the standard explanation for what came to be known as Washington's Diem experiment, that it was a consequence of the anti-communist ethos of the American Cold War and the anonymity of most Saigon politicians. Diem's virulent anti-communism, so the argument ran, made him the logical proxy for US Cold warriors seeking to hold the line against communist influence in Southeast Asia, especially insofar as Washington was unaware of anybody else who could take over this important job in South Vietnam. Diem was the only viable anti-communist game in town, as far as the Eisenhower administration was concerned, so America had no choice but to support him, or else see all of Vietnam go down the communist drain. Yes, he turned out to be an incompetent dictator. Yes, he killed an awful lot of people, but there was no alternative to him. And besides, Diem's faults weren't apparent right away, and American policymakers couldn't have known at the time that by supporting this man, they were making the United States a handmaiden to dictatorship. That is, I think, a fair summation of what historians had said about this fateful alliance between the Eisenhower administration and the Diem regime. I was surprised, therefore, to discover that Diem wasn't the only viable candidate to lead South Vietnam. As the record of administrative deliberations makes plain, several popular, qualified, and irreproachably anti-communist politicians in Saigon presented attractive alternatives to Diem, and every member of President Eisenhower's policymaking coterie was aware of their existence. One candidate, former Defense Minister Phan Huy Quat, came very close to unseating Diem, as J. Lawton Collins, Eisenhower's special representative in South Vietnam, relentlessly badgered Washington to get rid of Diem, to replace him with Quat. Other suitable candidates included Foreign Affairs Minister Tran Van Do, Defense Minister Ho Thong Min, Minister for Plans Nguyen Van Toya, and General Nguyen Van Hin, Chief of Staff of the Vietnamese National Army. All of these men had established their anti-communism beyond question in the 1946 to 54 war against the Viet Minh. All of these men were unquestionably anti-communist. All of them had much greater political experience than Ngo Dinh Diem. Yet none was able to secure the backing of the Eisenhower administration. Moreover, the contention that Diem initially governed South Vietnam as a liberal reformer who merited US sponsorship, only to lapse into autocracy and repression in the final months of his reign, is simply false. Evaluations composed by American observers during Diem's first few days in office identified exactly the same qualities that would bring about his downfall 9 years later. Discrimination against Buddhists and other non-Catholics, refusal to compromise on the most trifling of issues, pathological suspicion of potential rivals, and easy resort to violence to quell dissent. None of these idiosyncrasies should have come as a surprise to Eisenhower, Dulles, or any of those chief advisors to the president who were in charge of crafting policy towards South Vietnam at this time. To give you an example of some of the material I ran across, General Walter Bedell Smith, an American delegate to the Geneva Conference, reported to Washington after his first meeting with Ngo Dinh Diem that, quote, "I have no confidence whatsoever in this man's ability to form a viable political base. He is rigid in temperament and completely out of touch with developments in his own country," end quote. Donald Heath, America's ambassador to Saigon, wrote to the State Department after his first encounter with Diem, quote, "Diem is temperamentally unfitted to head a government in these trying times. He is too narrow and too intolerant, and besides, he has no popular appeal," end quote. These, and literally dozens of other similar official statements I ran across in the first few hours of my research, presented me with a historical problem that, fortunately for me, and hopefully fortunately for the field of diplomatic history, I decided was more interesting and valuable than the issue of whether or not John Foster Dulles did a good job at the Geneva Conference. If America's so-called Diem experiment was perceived as foolhardy in its own time, not merely in the hindsight of historians, if all of the conditions precluding a successful outcome were recognized or foreseen by at least a few people, and if feasible alternative courses of action were available and vigorously advocated, then how can we explain why, for almost a decade, American policymakers adhered to the strategy that one journalist derisively termed "sink or swim with Ngo Dinh Diem." Sink or swim with Ngo Dinh Diem. Why was Ngo Dinh Diem the horse that we chose to back? This question is important because, as the flyer for this evening's event states, America's commitment to preserve an independent South Vietnam under the leadership of Ngo Dinh Diem was one of the most ruinous foreign policy decisions of the post-war era. No ally did more than Diem to undermine the prestige and power of the United States. From 1954, when he became prime minister, to 1963, when he was assassinated, Diem ran South Vietnam as a one-party police state, while the United States bankrolled his tyranny. The Eisenhower administration invested billions of dollars and incalculable moral capital in Diem's regime, despite the fact that Diem did little to build a broadly based popular government. He was reclusive and paranoid. He depended almost exclusively upon his family. The governmental machinery in Saigon and the countryside became Diem's psyche writ large, reflecting in its body of laws and personnel Diem's prudery, nepotism, authoritarianism, and religious bigotry. Diem closed saloons, dance halls, and theaters. He banned the use of contraceptives. He even advocated legislation prohibiting women from wearing falsies until questions about enforcement procedures proved embarrassing. He staffed his administration almost entirely with Catholics in a nation over 90% Buddhist. He destroyed the indigenous leadership in South Vietnam's villages and replaced it with his own appointees. And he ordered the execution, internment, or deportation of tens of thousands of perceived traitors. And these violations of human rights were not compensated by gains in political stability or prosperity. Indeed, Diem faced increasingly ungovernable insurgencies and debts with each succeeding year. When America's Diem experiment ended in a hail of bullets during the Kennedy administration, South Vietnam was in an even greater state of chaos than it had been in during the tempestuous early months of its creation. So, while every historical phenomenon is subject to waves of revision and counter-revision, it would be extremely difficult for a responsible historian to characterize America's sink-or-swim policy as anything other than a disaster. When Ngo Dinh Diem became Prime Minister of South Vietnam in 1954, there were several dozen American advisors in his fledgling nation. By the time of his death in 1963, US personnel in country exceeded 16,000 men. France, the dominant Western military power in Vietnam for almost a century, refused to endorse America's Diem experiment and relinquished its former colony within a year of Diem's assumption of office, thereby conferring upon the United States primary responsibility for stemming the communist tide in Southeast Asia. Diem's reign marked America's crossover point from advice and support to active co-belligerency in a Vietnamese civil war. The commitment to Ngo Dinh Diem was the most fundamental decision of America's lengthy involvement in Vietnam. It was the critical prerequisite for the subsequent incremental steps that culminated in defeat and humiliation for the United States. So it's not surprising that I found this a compelling question. Why? Why did the Eisenhower administration inaugurate its policy of sink or swim with Ngo Dinh Diem? Why would intelligent statesmen like President Dwight Eisenhower and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles behave in a manner so contrary to the way that reason pointed? Now, as luck would have it, around the time that I was reformulating my research agenda, I fell under the spell of an absolutely revelatory book by Michael Hunt called Ideology and U.S. Foreign Policy. This is probably the book that has made the greatest intellectual impact on me among all the monographs I've read, either in graduate school or since then. It completely changed the way that I understood my craft as a diplomatic historian and compelled me to look at documents that many other scholars had examined, indeed that I had examined previously, with new eyes, as it were. I won't try to summarize Hunt's book here, but the passage that leapt out at me the first time I read it, and that has subsequently informed all of my scholarly work, reads as follows, quote, "To move in a world of infinite complexity, individuals and societies need to reduce that world to finite terms. Only then can they pretend an understanding of their environment and have the confidence to talk about it and the courage to act on it. Policymaking, like any other individual or collective activity, requires that simplifying clarity. Ideology is an interrelated set of convictions or assumptions that reduces the complexities of a particular slice of reality to easily comprehensible terms and suggests ways of dealing with that reality," end quote. And of course, that's true. We are, all of us, constantly bombarded with more information and sense data than we can absorb. If I had the rest of my natural life, I would not be able to describe in complete detail every feature of this lectern in front of me, or the table, or the wall behind me. I have to be able to identify certain features as important and others as irrelevant, or I can't function. Ideology processes the world for us including policymakers. It condenses and crystallizes the world for us so that we can act in it. And to put that in terms more relevant to the Diem experiment, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles had never encountered a more alien state of affairs than this wars within wars maelstrom that raged in South Vietnam in 1954 and 1955. Dulles knew nothing about Vietnam, and neither did most Americans at the time. There were no authorities on Vietnam at the State Department. No courses on Vietnamese culture or history were offered at any American university. No one in Washington could speak or write Vietnamese. In fact, no published works on Vietnam in English were still in print. Dulles, like every other policymaker, was completely ignorant about Vietnam. He couldn't begin to fathom the cauldron of competing ethnic, economic, and political groups in Saigon. But he could, as Hunt puts it, pretend an understanding. His ideology isolated certain features of South Vietnam in the mid-1950s as salient and crucial, screened out discordant information, and then applied some basic precepts to determine what Washington's response should be. He was then able to make policy appropriate to the situation as he comprehended it. And as I argue in my book, the fact that Ngo Dinh Diem was a Christian and his rivals were not proved to be the organizing principle that Dulles and other policymakers seized upon in solving the riddle of Vietnam. I'll come back to that point in a bit because obviously it's a major part of my overall thesis. But it wasn't when I began researching. Even after I decided to take an explicitly ideological approach, it simply never occurred to me in the beginning to use religion as a category of analysis because as far as I knew, no diplomatic historian had ever done anything like that. In fact, during the first year and a half of my research, the category of race really dominated the project. Race was going to be my big category of analysis under the rubric of ideology. I should admit that it wasn't a particularly original category of analysis. Other diplomatic historians had applied it to America's Cold War foreign policy. Indeed, other diplomatic historians had applied it specifically to the Vietnam War. So I wasn't exactly a pioneer here, although the particular dimension of American racism explored in my book is, I believe, innovative. Racism just pervades Washington's post-war relations with Asia. You can find it in virtually every dispatch from a US embassy in an Asian country. And as I discovered while plowing through my primary sources, a key tenet of American racism held that Asians were not ready for democratic self-government. From the perspective of American policymakers like Dulles, it was absurd to expect these backward, childlike people to responsibly conduct their own political affairs. They needed a strict, even ruthless, national father figure, either in the form of an occupying Western army or a native tyrant to avoid degenerating into anarchy. And with regard to Vietnam, this paternalistic construct was confirmed by supposed experts like Professor Wesley Fischel of Michigan State University, a close friend of Ngo Dinh Diem, employed by both the State Department and the CIA to advise policymakers on Vietnamese politics and culture. As Fischel wrote in a 1959 article for the magazine New Leader, quote, "The peoples of Southeast Asia are not sufficiently sophisticated to understand what we mean by democracy and how they can exercise and protect their own political rights. That individual human rights may often be neglected or sacrificed in this period of national infancy should not be surprising," end quote. And that patronizing, really infantilizing perception of Asians, I found, was reflected in State Department correspondence, departmental and interdepartmental committee reports, top secret foreign policy analyses, testimony before congressional committees, and so on. It was also seemingly everywhere in American popular culture in the Eisenhower years. In blockbuster movies like The King and I and The Bridge on the River Kwai, in best-selling novels like The Quiet American and The Ugly American, and the dozen or so books that James Michener wrote during the 1950s, and in the most widely read magazines of the period, Time, Life, and Reader's Digest. The Asia presented was a relatively consistent construct, a place where people were accustomed to serving strong masters, did not seek the rights and freedoms common to Western societies, and were just too backward to participate in their own governance. And I found that these kind of racist notions played into Diem's hands. His undisguised ambition to govern South Vietnam as a dictator didn't really trouble American policymakers, since they believed that any attempt to grant these illiterate, superstitious, and frankly childish peasants a voice in government would only invite communist takeover. From their perspective, circumstances in South Vietnam required that Diem wield absolute authority. And the fact that Diem's government lacked any popular legitimacy didn't bother the Eisenhower administration because US policymakers believed that the Vietnamese simply weren't mature enough to make decisions like determining who was best qualified to govern them. Race ultimately became one of the two dominant themes of my book. I've tried to show how men like Eisenhower and Dulles grew up in a culture shaped by more than a century of stereotypical depictions of Asians, and that when they looked at Vietnam in the mid-1950s, they saw what their background had conditioned them to see. Whether I've succeeded in making that case is, of course, not for me to judge, but my initial instinct that race would play an important role in my research proved correct. But another category proved much more important. The category of analysis that wound up complementing race in my book, the category of analysis that has attracted by far the most attention and outrage by people who have read the book, really emerged by accident. It was not mentioned in my original dissertation proposal, or the first two revised proposals, or any of my applications for research funding. I actually resisted this category for a long time, until the evidence for it became so overwhelming that I had no choice but to make it part of my study. And I'd like to devote the remainder of my talk tonight to this category, since I now believe that it constitutes the most valuable, albeit controversial, contribution to the field of diplomatic history that my book makes. I think that if anybody's still assigning America's Miracle Man in Vietnam to their students 5 years from now, if anybody's still reading it, it will be because of this feature, this part of the book's overall argument. As I did my work in government archives and presidential libraries, in the papers of citizens and private organizations whose non-governmental status has frequently rendered them invisible to historians of the Vietnam War, and the many outlets of 1950s popular culture, I became aware that I was researching a period of tremendous religious revival in the United States, a latter-day Great Awakening, inextricably bound up with the anxieties of the Cold War. It was one of the most remarkable upsurges of piety in American history, and it frequently expressed itself in hatred and fear of America's godless geopolitical opponent. As the evangelist Billy Graham proclaimed in 1954, the year that Ngo Dinh Diem rose to power in South Vietnam, quote, "Only as millions of Americans turn to Jesus Christ at this hour and accept him as Savior can this nation possibly be spared the onslaught of demon-possessed communism. If you would be a true patriot, then become a Christian. If you would be a loyal American, then become a loyal Christian," end quote. And it gradually became apparent to me that policymakers like Dulles and millions of Americans in general had been attracted to Ngo Dinh Diem because he shared their conception of the Cold War as a crusade in which Americans needed to combine with fellow Judeo-Christians against an adversary dangerous as much for his atheism as his military might. This presented me with a problem, though. I couldn't help but note that Michael Hogan and Thomas Patterson's invaluable book, Explaining the History of American Foreign Relations, which is required reading for all teachers and students in diplomatic history. Everybody has to read this book in grad school. It does not include religion among the many conceptual approaches and analytical methods that are presented as recognized ways of studying American foreign policy. It includes just about everything else: bureaucratic politics, psychology, national security, corporatism, world systems, dependency, modernization, cultural transfer, and of course, race and gender. But it doesn't include religion as a recognized category of analysis. And this provided me with a real problem because I am not by nature what you would call a maverick. My wife is here and she can confirm that. And at this point, I was in my early 30s. I had 2 kids. I basically wanted to finish my dissertation and get out on the job market. I didn't want to be one of those perpetual graduate students who spends years pursuing a hopelessly iconoclastic and disreputable angle of interpretation that nobody else takes seriously. But I was also convinced that I was onto something, so I asked my dissertation advisor what I should do. And I'll be forever grateful to my advisor, Michael Sherry, who told me in no uncertain terms that I should definitely explore this dimension of policymaking in the Eisenhower years. And when I protested that I was not a theologian or a religious historian, that I'd only taken 1 graduate-level course on American religious history, and that I'd found it really boring, and that I really didn't know much about America's mid-century theological renaissance, Mike replied with characteristic bluntness, "Gee, well, then I guess you'd better learn about it, hadn't you?" Religion is a category of analysis that is very alien to diplomatic historians. The connection between American religious history and foreign policy has been persistently neglected for obvious reasons. Americans are supposed to separate church and state. We're supposed to live in a country where politics and religion do not mix. Of course, we know they do mix all the time. Televangelists like Pat Robertson run for president. Politicians go conspicuously to church and make a point of telling us how devout they are. And this makes a difference, I'm sorry, but it does, in how people vote and how public servants govern. Religion, if it impacts the most profound mores of life, will inevitably play a role in framing foreign policy. And the 1950s, I learned, were a period of unprecedented religious revival in the United States. If statistics mean anything, and maybe they don't, but if they do, this may have been the most religious decade in American history. It was certainly the most religious decade of the 20th century, whereas previous periods of religious enthusiasm have generally affected only certain segments of the population, usually lower and middle-class Protestants. All faiths, all classes were influenced during the 1950s. Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, rich and poor, old and young, blacks and whites, suburbanites and city dwellers, everybody. Year after year, throughout Dwight Eisenhower's presidency, polls tracked greater numbers of Americans affirming a belief in God and the power of prayer. Churches and synagogues sprang up all over America. Church membership rose twice as fast as the general population, and this is the baby boom era. Evangelists like Billy Graham and Oral Roberts led outdoor crusades for audiences in excess of 100,000 people. Theologians like Martin Buber, Paul Tillich, Karl Barth, and especially Reinhold Niebuhr gained a prominence among the intellectual elite that no religious thinkers had possessed in America since the First Great Awakening. In 1952, the Supreme Court reached a decision reversing one of 1948, in which it allowed for release time from public schools for religious instruction. Justice William O. Douglas, not coincidentally a very close friend and supporter of No Dien Diem, wrote in the Supreme Court's majority opinion, quote, "We are a religious people whose institutions presuppose a supreme being," end quote. Religious kitsch simply saturated American society in the 1950s. Popular songs included such favorites as I Believe, It's No Secret What God Can Do, The Man Upstairs, Vaya con Dios, and my personal favorite, Big Fellow in the Sky. Films with religious themes like The Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur did big business. The sales of Bibles reached an all-time record in the 1950s. Nearly half the books on the bestseller list were religious books, among them such historical curiosities as The Power of Prayer on Plants and Pray Your Weight Away. I'm not making those titles up. Every Friday afternoon in the 1950s, children watching the Howdy Doody show were exhorted by Buffalo Bob to, quote, worship at the church or synagogue of your choice, end quote. And Dwight Eisenhower, the president, far from being a passive observer of this religious revival, actively encouraged this nationwide turn toward God. Eisenhower signed legislation adding the phrase, under God, to the Pledge of Allegiance, and in God we trust to American currency. Eisenhower endorsed a congressional resolution making In God We Trust the national motto. It used to be E Pluribus Unum. It became In God We Trust in the 1950s. Eisenhower even seriously considered advocating an amendment to the Constitution that stated, quote, this nation devoutly recognizes the authority and law of Jesus Christ, Savior and ruler of nations, through whom are bestowed the blessings of Almighty God, end quote. Eisenhower made a point of commencing both of his inaugural addresses with a prayer. A riff through Eisenhower's public papers turns up literally thousands of pronouncements on the importance of religion in American life. My favorite is from a televised address in February 1954, when Eisenhower said, quote, our system demands the supreme being. There can be no question about the American system being the translation into the political world of a deeply felt religious faith. Without God, there could be no American form of government or an American way of life. Recognition of a supreme being is the first and most basic expression of Americanism, end quote. Eisenhower appointed John Foster Dulles, the chairman of the Federal Council of Churches, as his Secretary of State. Dulles was the only religious leader, lay or clerical, ever to become Secretary of State, and as I argue in my book, Dulles was the most unapologetically religious man to superintend American foreign policy since William Jennings Bryan. Now, in a deeply religious period, one religion in particular reached something of a pinnacle in the United States. The historian Charles Morris observes in his recent study, American Catholic, that, quote, a team of alien anthropologists would have reported that 1950s America was a Catholic country. In the 1950s, the Catholic Church was the country's dominant cultural force. No other institution could match its impact on politics, unions, movies, or even popular kitsch, end quote. America's Catholic population doubled between 1940 and 1960, reaching almost 27% of the national population. Books with explicitly Catholic themes numbered among the 1950s biggest bestsellers. Bishop Fulton Sheen's television program, Life is Worth Living, captured the largest TV audience of any program in the mid-1950s. Depictions of Catholic priests and nuns in the movies, which despite television are still mid-century America's dominant mass medium, were overwhelmingly favorable. And that hadn't always been the case. Take a look at 1930s films like Little Caesar or Public Enemy with their cultic and primitive depictions of Catholics. Those 1930s films were representative of a long strain of anti-Catholicism in the United States. But the cinema image really changed once the Cold War hit. Tellingly, the Hollywood priest of the Cold War era was a virile and aggressive figure, prepared to back up his principles with his fists. If you've seen the movie On the Waterfront, which came out in 1954, Carl Malden plays a character called Father Barry, who literally flattens a former prize fighter, played by Marlon Brando. Very important symbolic moment. And in many other areas of American life, Catholic influence on foreign policy was at its zenith in the early Cold War. This was primarily a consequence of a reversal in American attitudes toward the Soviet Union. In the interest of the wartime alliance with Joseph Stalin against Hitler, American war propagandists had portrayed the Soviets as heroic allies. They portrayed Stalin as a heroic man. But as diplomatic relations between the victors worsened in the years after 1945, American images of Stalin changed rapidly. By 1950, most Americans regarded Joseph Stalin and communism with the same horror that they'd reserved for Hitler and Nazism just 5 years before. For American Catholics, however, zealous anti-communism was nothing new. Catholic schools and colleges had been teaching it for the best part of a century. So when public opinion in the United States underwent a turn away from sympathy for the Soviet Union, the nation's Catholic population was already fully prepared. Catholic anti-communism predated what we call McCarthyism by several decades, and American Catholics benefited from being far in the vanguard of public opinion. Catholic credentials looked absolutely impeccable in waging Cold War. And this kind of information proved tremendously important to me when I researched the so-called Passage to Freedom, the flight of North Vietnamese Catholics, the flight of Catholics from North Vietnam to South Vietnam, beginning in the spring of 1954. Passage to Freedom, in my opinion, is one of the key events in the history of American post-war foreign policy, and particularly in the history of America's war in Vietnam. What we might call the First Vietnam War, the war between the French and the Communist Viet Minh, ended in 1954. After the French were defeated by the Viet Minh at the famous Battle of Dien Bien Phu, they sought to negotiate their way out of Vietnam, just like the Americans would try to do about 20 years later. And at the Geneva Conference of 1954, France, the Viet Minh, the Communist Chinese, Great Britain, and the United States basically worked out an arrangement called the Geneva Accords. Among other things, the Geneva Accords stipulated that Vietnam would be provisionally divided at the 17th parallel until 1956, when all Vietnam elections would be held to unify the country. And the Geneva Accords also stipulated that the Vietnamese would be permitted 300 days in which to move freely across the 17th parallel if they wanted to relocate from north to south or from south to north. 300 days. Then the border would be sealed, pending the nationwide elections. A few thousand South Vietnamese traveled north, But the vast majority of those who moved were North Vietnamese. About 1 million North Vietnamese, about 90% of them Catholics from the Hanoi Delta, who undertook a fairly hazardous journey south. Day after day, until the free movement period stipulated by the Accords elapsed in May of 1955, French and US ships departed from North Vietnam as fast as the refugees could be loaded on board. They made over 500 trips in 300 days, and all told about 1 million Vietnamese. Over 1/12 of the population of North Vietnam moved from north to south in what the US Navy dubbed Operation Passage to Freedom. Passage to Freedom was a dramatic story, and as you might imagine, the American media leapt on it. US press coverage of Passage to Freedom, which was very heavy, was saturation coverage, basically emphasized 3 themes: the devoutness of the Catholic refugees, the terrible suffering they endured in making their pilgrimage south, and the wickedness of the communist Viet Minh, who had promised to assist all North Vietnamese desiring to relocate below the 17th parallel, but who now employed every dilatory tactic from bureaucratic stonewalling to torture and murder to stem this Catholic exodus. And while the most lurid write-ups appeared in the American Catholic press, secular magazines, secular newspapers also portrayed the flight from North to South Vietnam in highly emotional, melodramatic terms. For example, a fleeing Vietnamese bishop was quoted approvingly by Time magazine to the effect that, quote, "Any Catholic in this country betrays his faith if he is not a soldier. To compromise with communism is treachery. You must fight. It is the only Christian solution," end quote. Life magazine called the refugees' ordeal, quote, "a tragedy of almost nightmarish proportions. Many went without food or water or medicine for days, sustained only by the faith in their hearts," end quote. The Washington Sunday Star reported, quote, "the core of anti-communist resistance among the Vietnamese is the Catholic population. Monasteries have been converted into basic training camps, troop quarters, supply centers, and ammunition dumps. People who have spent Christmas with the Catholic Vietnamese say that each soldier makes his own tiny manger and worships at it in his foxhole or dugout," end quote. You would never gather from reading this that Catholics made up only about 8 to 10% of all Vietnamese. Moreover, they made up only a small percentage of anti-communist Vietnamese. The Viet Minh actually considered the Cao Dai and Ho Hao religious sects much greater threats than the Catholics. As might be expected, the American Catholic press outdid their secular competitors in portraying the flight of the refugees from north to south as a modern-day miracle pageant, with good pitted against evil. The magazine Jubilee waxed ecstatic as it described the welcome that Diem's government extended to the exiles. Quote, "The scene was biblical. I saw the Catholic Church here playing an important fighting role not duplicated since the Crusades," end quote. The Ave Maria noted, quote, "Traditionally, those who have suffered much before the world in the confession of their faith have been given the title confessor. It would seem that at the present time, the Church is being given hundreds of thousands of candidates for that title in the land of Vietnam," end quote. And the Jesuit magazine America reminded its readers, quote, "Among all Oriental countries, Vietnam yields only to the Philippines in the number of her Catholics. Vietnamese Catholics proudly point to the 100,000 in the last 300 years who have willingly shed their blood rather than deny their faith in Christ," end quote. Patrick O'Connor, a reporter stationed in Hanoi by the National Catholic Welfare Conference, churned out numerous accounts of communist persecution of Catholics. Passage to Freedom received weekly front-page coverage in all of America's 111 diocesan newspapers, and for the most part, it was O'Connor's dispatches, his sensationalistic reports, that were run in these papers. I discovered that O'Connor was published in many secular papers as well. To give you a sense of his style, this is a standard Patrick O'Connor dispatch. Quote, "The communist Viet Minh oblige Catholics to attend classes in atheism. They frequently beat, dismember, and murder priests and nuns before audiences of Catholic school children. Viet Minh prisons are a graveyard for thousands of priests and nuns who have been tortured to death. A favorite technique of the communist Viet Minh is to force an infant's mother to watch while they slowly pull the baby in half in a grotesque tug-of-war. The scenes of this exodus are more horrible than anything one can imagine. If we in America adopt the attitude of Pontius Pilate about the blood that is being shed in Christ's name in Vietnam today, be sure that tomorrow it will be our blood that will flow, end quote. And O'Connor's magnum opus was his final report from Hanoi, just before that city, the capital of North Vietnam, fell under communist control. This report was printed, as far as I can tell, in full in almost every Catholic newspaper in the United States. And in it, O'Connor pounded home with an almost demented passion and refrain the tragedy that had befallen what he termed, quote, a once godly city, end quote. I can't possibly read this entire report. You wouldn't want me to. But let me give you a flavor. Quote, "Goodbye to Hanoi, to the city pavements where I have seen men go down on both knees to kiss the bishop's ring in public. Goodbye to Hanoi, to the hallowed gray cathedral, to all the churches, none of which I have ever seen without worshipers. Goodbye to Hanoi, to the schools I have seen thronged with Vietnamese youth learning from Catholic brothers and sisters, schools I've later seen crowded with refugees who left everything for their faith. Goodbye to Hanoi, to the little Lord's grotto that a poor candlemaker's family illuminates night after night with candles of their own making. Goodbye to Hanoi, where young men who craved independence and reform listened to Karl Marx and not to Christ. Hanoi, to which they now return with a red flag. Goodbye to Hanoi, where prayer will not cease and grace will not be wanting in Vietnam's church of silence. Goodbye, Hanoi," end quote, and so on at much greater length and in the same over-the-top tone. O'Connor was not known for his subtlety. The overall effect of this kind of journalism was to render the Vietnamese Civil War, in American eyes, not as a battle between communists and non-communists, but as a battle between communists and Catholics. And after the heart-rending spectacle of Passage to Freedom was promulgated in American newspapers and magazines and on movie and television screens, any abandonment by the United States of South Vietnamese emigre martyrs, and by extension, their champion, Ngo Dinh Diem, was viewed by millions of Americans, frankly, as an unchristian breach of faith, a Judas kiss. Now, although many seasoned correspondents covered Passage to Freedom, the author who really made this event live in the American popular imagination was a 26-year-old Catholic Navy doctor named Tom Dooley. Dooley, who assisted in Passage to Freedom, wrote a best-selling book about his experiences titled Deliver Us from Evil. I want to stress that Tom Dooley's book became the great early bestseller on Vietnam. The book went through 20 printings in English alone, and it was translated into more languages than any text save the Bible. It was one of the most influential works of propaganda produced during the Cold War. It was certainly the most significant in terms of cementing America's alliance with the Diem regime. If you read Deliver Us from Evil, and please, I'm not suggesting that you do so, but if you do, you will find that it is full of really disgusting, there's no other word for it, atrocity stories. There's one involving a priest whom Dooley claimed to have encountered in the living quarters of the Philippine Catholic Mission in Haiphong. As Dooley described it, quote, "His head was matted with pus, and there were 8 large pus-filled swellings around his temples and forehead. Even before I asked what had happened, I knew the answer. This priest had been punished for teaching treason. His sentence was a communist version of the crown of thorns once forced on the Savior of whom he preached. 8 nails had been driven into his head, 3 across the forehead, 2 in the back of the skull, and 3 across the dome. The nails were large enough to embed themselves in the skull bone," end quote. And there was another story where Dooley accused the Viet Minh of jamming chopsticks into the ears of little children and splitting their eardrums so they couldn't listen to the Lord's Prayer anymore. He had one vignette recounting the ordeal of, quote, "a valiant 57-year-old priest whom the communists had left a mass of blackened flesh from the shoulders to the knees. The belly was hard and distended, and the scrotum was swollen to the size of a football," end quote. I should point out that many scholars of Vietnamese history have strongly questioned, or they strongly dispute, whether these atrocities really took place. Nonetheless, Tom Dooley became a national celebrity with the publication of Deliver Us from Evil. A Gallup poll ranked Dooley among the 10 most admired men in the world. He was number 3, right after the Pope and President Eisenhower. Dooley toured the United States, making speeches on behalf of the South Vietnamese government of Ngo Dinh Diem before wildly enthusiastic crowds. And indeed, one historian writes that Tom Dooley was such a public relations wizard that, quote, many Americans came to believe that Vietnam was a preponderantly Catholic country, end quote. I should stress, I probably don't need to do this, but just in case I do, I am not blaming a Catholic conspiracy for America's war in Vietnam. I find that argument as bigoted as it is intellectually unrigorous. While prominent American Catholics were among Diem's most zealous supporters, Catholicism per se was much less instrumental in the Eisenhower administration's covenant with Diem than the popular conceptualization of what religion was, what religion constituted in Eisenhower's America. Religion in this context must be understood as a very narrow-gauged category, encompassing only the major organized churches of the West. Protestant, Catholic, Jew, to cite the title of Will Herberg's 1955 best-selling book. Religion, for policymakers like Eisenhower and Dulles, did not include such purportedly Eastern faiths as Buddhism, Taoism, or Confucianism. There's very compelling evidence that American delimitation of what did and did not constitute a real religion made a real difference in terms of how American policymakers selected America's Cold War allies. One of the most fascinating documents I encountered in my earliest visits to the Eisenhower Library was a memorandum of a February 4th, 1954 National Security Council meeting. This meeting took place during the closing stages of the Franco-Viet Minh War, and the minutes record that the CIA director complained that, quote, there was no dynamism in the leadership of the non-communist Vietnamese forces, end quote. And according to the minutes, quote, the president interrupted to inquire if it would be a viable strategy to make Vietnamese religion, by definition opposed to communist atheism, work to America's advantage. Given that the vast majority of the people in Vietnam were Buddhists, the president asked whether it was possible to find a good Buddhist leader to whip up some real anti-communist fervor, end quote. The source of the next comment is unnamed, but he clearly voiced a shared sentiment. According to the minutes of the meeting, quote, it was pointed out to the president that unhappily Buddha was a pacifist rather than a fighter. This led to laughter and great merriment, end quote. President Richard Nixon then, quote, expressed some doubt as to the strength and conviction with which the people of Vietnam clung to their religious views, end quote. And according to the minutes, quote, the president maintained that he still believed there was something to the idea of a religious motivation. The president concluded that Vietnamese Emperor Bao Dai was unsatisfactory as a rallying point for religious or nationalist sentiment, but pointed out how Joan of Arc had managed to defeat a large enemy force and place a timid king upon his throne in France, end quote. And picking up on this Joan of Arc theme, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles remarked that, quote, there were, of course, 1.5 million Roman Catholics in Vietnam, and they included most of the best brains in the country. The president reiterated that the United States should search for some way to capitalize on the religious issue, end quote. Now, if this were the only example of Buddhist bashing in the record, we could probably dismiss it as an aberration. But as I discovered in subsequent visits to the Eisenhower Library, to the National Archives, to the Dulles Papers, and many other archives, there are innumerable cases of really virulent anti-Buddhist sentiment in the store of intergovernmental documents for this period. Since I'm coming to the end of my time, I'll just mention 2. The director of Philippine and Southeast Asian Affairs in the State Department informed Eisenhower in 1954 that, quote, Buddhist monks are well-known communists and fellow travelers, and for years have been actively promoting communist causes. Devotees of Christianity and Islam believe in gods to whom they pray, whereas Buddhism does not teach belief in God, but in man's own efforts to attain perfection. Thus, Buddhism is a philosophy and not a religion. This position relieves Buddhism of the Marxist stigma of being an opiate of the people and makes Buddhism appear compatible with communism, end quote. And that same year, a national intelligence estimate informed Eisenhower, quote, "The only truly anti-communist group in Vietnam is the Catholics. The nature of their religion and the strength of their faith prevents infiltration by other groups. Catholic leadership in the government is the only way to assure a national government free of communist influence," end quote. And there are many, many other examples I could cite. So is it any wonder that no South Vietnamese leader, other than the militantly Catholic Ngo Dinh Diem, could secure US support during the Eisenhower years? And this kind of bias wasn't restricted to confidential government reports. If you take a look at popular culture, you find the same depiction of Buddhism as somehow too weak, too stagnant to serve American Cold War interests. Vietnam's predominant religion was invariably identified with passivity, unindustriousness, and moral relativism. These are hardly desirable qualities in an ally when you're waging a crusade. Life magazine's 1955 series, The World's Great Religions, followed up its first installment on Hinduism with an examination of Buddhism, in which the magazine declared, quote, "Its avoidance of force and coercion makes Buddhism one of the world's most gentle religions and may be a weakness in its defense against communism. The question is whether the practical moral vigor of Buddhism runs deeply enough to make it Southeast Asia's spiritual bulwark against communist aggression. Buddhist passivity could be helpful to communism," end quote. And Newsweek described the Vietnamese Cao Dai and Hoa Hao sects as, quote, "pseudo-religious sects which follow a perverted form of Buddhism, capitalizing on harebrained pacifist offshoots like Ouija boards and worshiping a fantastic assortment of gods ranging from Buddha and Confucius to Victor Hugo, Charlie Chaplin, and Laurel and Hardy," end quote. And the magazine American Mercury observed in this just appalling passage that, quote, "The one group in Vietnam from which no one expects anything now or ever is the Buddhists. Buddhism has slowly foundered into a mire of oriental somnolence. To its followers, it offers inertia and calls it wisdom. Buddhism does nothing and graces it with such adorning words as reflection and tolerance. Its branches are countless, but whether they are a family-type Buddhism or the ascetic with precious names such as the perfumed lotus of the Jade Fountain, Buddhism represents no threat of force," end quote. That's a really remarkable statement, given that most Viet Minh were Buddhists, and their religion did not seem to prevent their being really, really tough warriors. Indeed, any nation that manages over the course of its history to defeat the Mongol Empire, France, the United States of America, and the People's Republic of China is not likely to have a dominant church whose primary impact upon the citizenry is to make them really soft and docile. Now, obviously, I don't believe that religion was the sole determinant of American foreign policy in Vietnam or anywhere else. But I think it's surely significant that 3 of America's major protégés in Asia during the 1950s, Ngo Dinh Diem in South Vietnam, Syngman Rhee in South Korea, and Chiang Kai-shek of nationalist China, were Christians. They're all Christians, despite the fact that neither South Vietnam, South Korea, nor nationalist China was a predominantly Christian nation. And I think it's moreover worthy of note that even after the miserable experience we had with Ngo Dinh Diem, most of the South Vietnamese presidents whom Americans found acceptable, and they wouldn't have lasted in office a day without US support, were Catholics. Duong Van Minh, Nguyen Thanh, and Nguyen Van Thieu. In fact, South Vietnam fell to the communists on Nguyen Van Thieu's watch. In the words of one journalist, quote, "Sink or swim with Ngo Dinh Diem had come full circle to see it through with Nguyen Van Thieu," end quote. Thieu, although a much suppler politician than Diem and considerably less of a religious zealot, was also a Catholic, which indicates, to me at least, that the ideological predispositions that informed America's support for South Vietnam's first president persisted, if in muted form, into the administration of its last. Thank you. I really went over my time. I'm sorry about that. And this was with prepared notes. Can you imagine if I had just been free associating, we would have been here till tomorrow.
Take any questions now? Anyone want to be first? I'll actually start out. I'm just curious if Dulles and Eisenhower ever came to regret, either in their public or private life, supporting Diem because of his Catholicism. Did they ever follow up on any of that?
Well, Dulles died in 1959, and he never expressed any regret about Diem. I couldn't find it anywhere in his papers. Eisenhower very briefly expressed a moment of regret in 1960, just before turning over the presidency to John F. Kennedy. There was an obviously rigged presidential election in Saigon, and then there was an attempted coup that almost overthrew Diem, and then there was a public statement, the Caraval Manifesto, in which 15 of the most prominent South Vietnamese politicians called Diem a dictator and said things were worse in South Vietnam than when he first took office. One after another, these events occurring, and Eisenhower mentioned offhand in a NSC meeting, maybe we made a mistake with this guy. Maybe J. Lawton Collins was right way back in 1954 when he told me to get somebody else. But it was a passing, fleeting moment, and then he moved on to something else, because this was right during the U-2 crisis, and he had more important things. Vietnam had long since receded from the forefront of his consciousness at that point. So.
Anyone next?
How would the importance of the religious revival in America in the 1950s, its importance in the civil rights movement, have crossed over to the racist element in our decisions in Vietnam, if you can say anything about that?
Well, there's a book called Another Part of the 50s by Paul Carter, in which he draws a really sharp distinction between popular 50s religiosity as embodied by someone like Billy Graham or even Reinhold Niebuhr, and 1960s religiosity as embodied by someone like Martin Luther King and or Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. And Carter argues, and I agree with him, that that the more genuinely religious people, the people more true to the spirit of Christianity, came in the 60s rather than the 50s, where there's such an incredible attachment to the status quo. I think actually it's a remarkable coincidence, a bad coincidence for Ngo Dinh Diem, that at the same time that Buddhist monks are burning themselves in the streets of burning themselves alive in the streets of Saigon to protest his rule, Martin Luther King is stewing in a Birmingham jail. And all of a sudden, the kind of passive resistance that the Buddhists are exhibiting seems a lot more morally muscular in 1963 than it seemed in the 1950s.
You stated earlier in your speech about how religion played such a large role in choosing Diem as a leader. But don't you think, although the others were anti-communist, the fact that he was so anti-Ho Chi Minh played a large part in America's decision?
Yeah, the fact that he had called Ho Chi Minh a criminal to his face made a big deal. That play got great play when he went to the United States. Also, he was the only one of the candidates who had toured America in 50 to 53, so he had made himself better known to American policymakers, but they were certainly aware of these other candidates. I don't know, though, that you could say that Diem was any more anti-Ho Chi Minh than, say, Phan Huy Quat. Phan Huy Quat had been exiled from North Vietnam because Ho Chi Minh didn't like the fact that he wasn't a pliable enough servant. And Phan Huy Quat was one of the most venerated members of the Dai Viet Party in South Vietnam. He had his own run-ins with Ho Chi Minh. I think you could argue that Nguyen Van Thien also was pretty, his anti-communism, anti-Ho Chi Minh sentiment was pretty well documented. But you're right. I mean, that famous meeting in 1945 between Diem and Ho Chi Minh, where Ho actually offered Diem a position in his cabinet because he wanted to have a prominent Catholic in his cabinet to appeal to non-communist Vietnamese. And Diem basically said, no, you're a criminal, you burned the country. And then he turned around and stalked out of the meeting. And he used that to great effect in the United States to prove his anti-communist bona fides. So yeah, that did play a role.
Any last questions? Oh.
Yeah, I've taken a few classes with you, and I've heard that maybe the book, it was a little hard to get it published. I was wondering if you could discuss some of the things you had to do.
Yeah, okay. All right. I'm going to do this without mentioning any press that turned it down. I will mention that one press did turn it down and was less than encouraging in its comments. But actually, let me talk about the article that preceded the book. That actually, the article wound up winning a prize for best article in the field. But the first time I sent it into Diplomatic History, one of the reviewers, a dogmatic Marxist, I'm sure. I don't know if it was a man or a woman because they don't identify the reviewers, but it was someone who believed that religion was not important. It was epiphenomenal. It just wasn't relevant. He called the article, I think it was, quote, a masterpiece of irrelevance, end quote. He suggested that I find another line of work. or she, could have been a she. I really messed up this guy's day or this woman's day by suggesting that religion plays a role in foreign policy. And I couldn't believe, and it was later on I discovered a lot of people have that reaction, that it's a category of analysis that isn't used that often, which is surprising to me because it just seems intuitively obvious that if you've got a historical actor who genuinely believes that if he pursues a particular course of action, he's going to burn in hell. He's going to lie in a lake of raging hellfire and burn in indescribable agony for all time. If he really believes that, if he pursues a certain course of action, I submit he will not pursue that course of action, no matter how much money is involved. I can't believe this is a controversial thing to say, but it is. I mean, diplomatic historians just don't like to use religion. I should point out that Andrew Rotter, who's a very distinguished diplomatic historian, has recently published a piece linking American religious beliefs to relationships with India in the 1940s and early 50s. But this was, just an extremely quirky and weird category that really rubbed some people the wrong way. I think I didn't libel anybody there because I didn't name any names. So.
Any last questions? Thanks very much, Seth.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.